Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Hello and Happy New Year! In this episode, we spoke to Dorothy Armstrong about forgiveness, what makes a good apology, and the art of responding to difficult feedback.
Dorothy is a lead professional advisor to the Scottish Public Service's Ombudsman and director of DA Professional, which supports individuals, teams, and organizations to enhance communication, leadership, and well-being. She regularly presents seminars on the power of apology and listening and learning from feedback, and leads a complaints coach program for people in public-facing or leadership roles. She's a graduate of nursing at the University of Edinburgh, and in 2010 was awarded an Honorary Doctor of Science degree from the University of Edinburgh for service to the field of nursing.
If you love Noble Mind, please take a moment to leave us a review and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. As always, you can also hit up noblemindpodcast.com to get our show notes and join our listeners' email list. Thank you and enjoy the show. So we are here with Dorothy Armstrong. Welcome to Noble Mind. And we thought we would get ourselves started off today by just having you say hello to our listeners and tell them a little bit about who you are and what you're all about.
So hello, thank you so much for having me today. I'm Dorothy Armstrong, and I'm a registered nurse, an educator and coach, and the founder of DA Professional, which primarily supports individuals, teams and organisations around communicating at our best, but with a particular interest in feedback and complaints. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about today.
I am thinking that this episode will be our first episode of 2022. And was thinking that it feels to me a timely topic in the sense that around the new year, I feel like many of us are maybe wanting to unburden ourselves of issues of the past and perhaps ask for forgiveness, or we have outstanding issues we'd like to resolve. So thinking about this topic of complaints and apologies and forgiveness feels timely for me anyway. Yeah, so your work is exploring complaints and apologies. So maybe we could start maybe even a little bigger picture and just think about this idea of forgiveness, which it feels like must underlie a lot of the work that you do. So how do you think about forgiveness?
About 10 years ago, I started my work with Scotland's Ombudsman, which I'm sure, as you know, is where citizens can go if they feel they have been suffered an injustice. And primarily it involves people bringing a complaint. And through that work, it really led me to this interest in the emotions often underneath people who have those complaints. And along with that, what it's like for people to be on the receiving end. So that can be, my particular field is in healthcare, but it can be in education, it can be in the public service. And what I discovered through this work and through my study was that even if people were received in a way that showed them empathy, that gave them a meaningful apology, sometimes that wasn't accepted because there was that reluctance, I think, for that ability to forgive. And I guess over the last nearly 2 years, and you've mentioned the new year, and here we are in 2022, but I think particularly over the last 2 years with COVID, that has really come to the fore even more. So people who find themselves on the receiving end of whether it's a criticism, a concern, or a formal complaint, they found that really tough to hear. And even if they've responded in a way that is helpful, it relies on the person receiving that response to hear that and to forgive them and move on.
So one part of it is being able to offer a meaningful apology, and we can dig into that a little bit more too today. But then also on the receiver's end, to be willing to forgive. And it sounds like you're saying that's not always been something that maybe seems like it's been harder of late. Is that
Yeah, I think the work that I've become involved in has threaded through a whole number of different elements, one of which has been some of the neurophysiology, the understanding of the emotions. So if you like, the fight-flight response when people are vulnerable. And I think definitely there's been this common humanity thread throughout COVID where people have maybe responded in ways that has been different for them because they felt scared, they felt vulnerable, they've been living with uncertainty. So a lot of this has become escalated, and that's been really tough for people who have found themselves going above and beyond, working in those front patient facing, if it's health or a public sector. Well, all of us, in fact, have our own story to tell. So I think for me, what's also been fascinating about forgiveness is also, very recently, just last week, Desmond Tutu died at the age of 90. And he has been one of the key, the key teachers for me in this work. So his book, which I happen to have right here, is The Book of Forgiving, that he's written with his daughter. And he talks about a model of forgiveness. And that is something that I've incorporated in my webinars and seminars, because I think very often it can be helpful for people to understand perhaps what they're going through in terms of whether they can forgive or whether they can help that forgiveness path. And one of my favourite quotes from Desmond Tutu is, "We all make mistakes and we all need forgiveness." And I think it's so true. And yet, as we all know, is that we can be our own worst critic. So we need to give that self-compassion and that forgiveness to ourselves as well as to others.
So being able to be compassionate with oneself, in turn, enables us to be more compassionate and perhaps offer more meaningful, more heartfelt apologies.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think if people are helped or enabled to reflect on some of these difficult situations, whether it's professionally or personally, through a model or through understanding their own reactions, that can allow them to step back and see things from a different perspective. And then they can have that learning and growth too. Because if we respond in a way, for example, if you're met with someone who's very angry, and I think about, again, in healthcare, the inability to visit loved ones, the lack of communication because of all of the barriers and challenges that people have had to work with. If you're met with that anger as a caregiver, the natural response may well be to be angry or because that's when your whole amygdala, your fight-flight reaction comes into play. And what I hope to do in this work and to explore with people is if you can just pause for a moment and think about that reaction and perhaps think, well, what is maybe an unmet need, it may be an emotional reaction to what's happening in their lives, and perhaps respond in a different way.
Yeah, I'm thinking about forgiveness in that, as you were saying, it may be that it's been harder to find forgiveness of late because of perhaps the inherent stress and vulnerability that many of us are feeling. And that is sort of making me think about the importance of feeling safe when we forgive. That I'm just thinking about my own personal life and personal experiences. And, when I feel like I've been more capable of forgiveness, it's when I felt more safe in the relationship or in the world or in life.
In Desmond Tutu, in his model, this fourfold model that he talks about, he also dispels some of the myths around forgiveness. And I've come across that too in my work. So someone saying, for example, no, I can't forgive because I can't forget, or I don't want to forget. And you say, but forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about going through a process that will allow you to make a decision about whether you're able to let go or forgive. And a number of stories in his book as well describes that if we hold on to those emotions, then that resentment builds up in ourselves, and actually we carry that burden. Whereas if we can forgive, we don't need to forget, but we can recognize the issue. The model, and he talks about telling your story and then naming the hurt, which I love, because for many people, what is very important for them is telling their story. That can be therapeutic in itself, because many complaints arise where people don't feel they've been listened to, their voice hasn't been heard, and therefore you can then give them the ability to tell their story and then really hone in on what is the hurt, what is the element that you can then discover and then move on to. Are you going to forgive? And then either he talks about you renew or refresh the relationship, or you let it go. But by letting it go, you also let it go within your own self, and therefore you're not holding on to that hurt and that resentment.
Mm. So it sounds like what you're saying, if I've got an apology that I'm trying to make to somebody, or I'm trying to forgive somebody, that one thing that will facilitate that forgiveness happening is giving space to the person who's been wronged to share their story and to really feel heard. Because I'm thinking sometimes people say like, well, I said, I'm sorry. What do you want? That kind of thing. But like saying I'm sorry is not enough. There's something else. And so that's what you're describing here is one of these other things. Is there anything else like that also feels like it would facilitate the forgiveness process?
I think we really underestimate the importance of that listening in that safe space, and listening without judgment, listening without making assumptions. And many, many times, I believe we can prevent a complaint escalating by starting off with that ability to ask the open questions. So, Kate, tell me, or I might start the whole interaction with the apology. So, Kate, I'm so sorry to hear about your experience, not if or may or anything. So your truth, your experience is your truth. It's not about getting into defending it. It's about acknowledging that is what you believe happened. So I'm really sorry that happened, that was your experience. Could you just share a little bit more about that experience with me to help me understand? And then allow that, just open it up and allow that ability for that person to tell their story.
So really give them space and to explore and express their hurt and validate them, what they're going through. Yeah.
And the evidence from the work, mainly from psychologists around apology, is that it's one resource, it's one tool that opens up that dialogue where you're equal in that space. And by the very nature of me apologizing, it shows that I've listened to you, that I'm recognizing that there is an issue here, and that I am showing empathy. So it's a kind of powerful way of demonstrating empathy if you can give that effective apology.
One thing I've noticed recently about myself is that when I feel wronged in some way, when I conclude that I have been wronged, then I can actually sort of flip into almost like a fractious or churlish energy, like sort of a complaining child, like, no. It's an unflattering realization, but also realizing that may happen for other people. So and I also realize in myself, my perception, I'm triggered. So my perception is inaccurate, really. And I'm sort of I want to use the word child. I'm sort of in a childish energy, almost, not childlike.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on helping people to understand that's what may be happening when that is going on, it can be a really powerful way of learning. So, for example, I know from studying, say, the work of Sarah Mackay, so she's a neurophysiologist based in Sydney, and she explains in great depth the whole amygdala hijack concept. So your amygdala, your two little almond-shaped organs and deep in your kind of limbic part of your brain. And what you described there, Alex, is a lovely example of your amygdala may well be taken over. So you're acting in a way that is not logical sometimes, because you're not using the thinking part of your brain. You're going straight into this overdrive of emotion, and it works much, much quicker than the prefrontal cortex. So the thinking part of your brain doesn't kick in to something like 100 times later, and it's 0.004, I think, and 0.2 or something similar. I don't know how they even measured that, but the science is absolutely there. So we're behaving in these ways because we have been this amygdala hijacks the thinking. So that the notion of people when they say I couldn't think straight because I was stressed or I was frustrated or I was angry is actually true. We don't think straight because we've got this emotional part of our brain that kicks in.
So I guess one thing that can be tricky is to validate the person's experience while not validating their misperceptions.
Yeah. And that's something that comes up a lot in questions or in webinars. But why should I apologize if I've done nothing wrong? And, I would say to that, you can then use what I would call an empathetic apology. So we can all, as human beings, apologize for someone's experience, whether or not we actually acknowledge or even know if there's anything wrong. So the example that I would use for in this work with healthcare providers would be, nobody told me. I'm complaining because nobody communicated with me. Nobody told me that my mother was dying. Mm-hmm. And what we do often is we defend that by going to the notes and the records and say, well, actually, you were spoken to this day and this day. And we have a note that you were, that happened on this particular time. But actually, it doesn't matter because that person they didn't get the message. They didn't understand that for all those reasons that we've outlined around your emotional state. And therefore, in that situation, that is where you can absolutely validate it by saying, gosh, Alex, I'm so sorry that no one told you your mum was dying. What can we do now to help you move through this? Or, it's not about defending all the steps why you didn't tell you that, even although you might think, well, I actually know from these records that somebody did speak to this family, but the message didn't get through. So it's that complexity of communication, but the apology comes in, not saying, yes, you're right, we got it wrong. It comes in more around showing that empathy that whatever we did do, it wasn't right for you, or this was the impact that it had on you. Mm-hmm. And how can we then, again, listening to their story, they may then go on to say, and because you didn't tell me my mother was dying, I didn't get in to visit, or I didn't stop my holiday early enough. And then it's blame, and all of the other emotions that go with that. Mm-hmm. And you may not be able to resolve that for people. But the apology, I think, can be a way in if there is that possibility to acknowledge and understand to some degree the emotions involved with that particular interaction. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It seems like it takes so many skills at once. I'm just thinking like empathy and listening and, being able to like craft an apology that sort of has, takes appropriate responsibility for the impact, but then like doesn't sort of go along with a misunderstanding or something. There's just a lot there, I think, to sort of bring together.
Yeah, and one of the things that I offer are these kind of resources or I suppose a toolkit or acronyms that people find helpful, I think particularly in healthcare, busy, that they can remember and know that these are the elements, for example, that you would expect in a meaningful apology. However, I would also say at that time, even if I give you the most meaningful, empathetic, sincere apology, following the 5 steps, which we can outline, but even if we do that, it is still up to you whether you will accept that apology or not, and then perhaps go on to forgive that mistake. Mm-hmm. And for some people that's never going to be possible. And I find that really, really sad. It helps me just to acknowledge how sad it is that some people, regardless of how hard we try and how much we can focus on that empathy and listening, it will never be acceptance, and that they will continue to have that resentment and anger and pain. And we can't change that. And for many people, that is really tough because within healthcare in particular, we want to help, we want to fix, we want to make things better. And that isn't always possible.
Yeah, I'm also thinking in relationships that sometimes people try to use apology to almost like control the other person or force them into forgiving them. So the point that you're making here, that we ultimately can't, control the outcome of this situation, even if we have given the most heartfelt apology and really truly feel apologetic, that we can't impose forgiveness or force that other person to be in a place where they're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the things that I found really helpful for myself, both at work and personally, that I often share is the only behaviour we can change is our own. However, we can change the way that we respond, and that may have an impact. But for some individuals, as I say, depending on the situation, and it can be clearly that if there has been a significant mistake, I'm going to redo that a bit, but there's lots of blah, blah. I think what can be really difficult and challenging, though, is when we have used these resources and we give almost a part of ourselves in that empathy and that apology, seeking that forgiveness. And if it doesn't follow, then that can be a real challenge. And that's where I think, for me, self-compassion and recognizing that you may have to just let it go, and it will never change for them. And that is, I think, sadness is the emotion that I would recognize most around that. Well, that's what helps me most. I think, gosh, how sad that someone has made a choice to remain resentful, remain angry, because it's easier in a way, rather than working through the emotion. Yeah. And that's again with forgiveness. The myth around forgiveness is about, it's not forgetting. And it's not easy. It's not the easy option, because actually in order to forgive, you do have to listen and recognize your own emotion and then make a decision about how you're going to react to that and move on in your own life.
Thinking about both personal apologies and having to accept that another person, isn't ready to forgive, and also just the fundamental mystery that other people are, that I don't know what, I can only sort of make my best guess and try to listen and, hope that I'm offering an apology that will help this person. But who knows what their journey has been, or where they're coming from, or what other things need to get resolved before they can, accept this apology. That it's a whole journey. I mean, on the other side, when I'm needing to forgive someone, I know for me, there's a lot of little pieces that need to get figured out before I can sort of open up and really, truly forgive, and I'm also thinking about not just the personal level, but just in these last few years, there's been a lot of public apologies, I feel around the American Psychological Association recently put out a statement apologizing for perpetuating racism and harm, and a lot of stuff around the Me Too movement and people apologizing, and a lot of really bad apologies, but also some sincere ones, and then some real I do not forgive you kind of responses. The APA one recently that came out, several organizations said sorry, no, So either something about the apology missed the mark, or something else has to happen first, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think it is complex, and I think you're right. There's, again, the evidence would suggest it's never too late to apologize. And there are certain elements that are helpful. But even if we get it all right in terms of the language that we use and the empathy and the body language and the tone of voice and all of those complexities, there may well be that inability to accept that for, as you say, for a whole number of reasons. I think the work is ongoing. It's really complex. And I think with COVID, people have, it's maybe just one additional burden that they just don't want to go down that road about exploring even more difficult emotions. And so it's easier just to say, no, I'm not going there, and I'm not accepting this.
Right. Yeah. I also think there's a lot of, tell me what you think about this, that there's a lot of pressure to forgive, that there's a sense of forgiveness, it's a virtue. It's such a good thing. And if you're if you can't, then there's something wrong or bad, or you're failing in some way. And so I do think there can be this feeling people have to sort of hurry up and forgive or to get over things. So I guess I don't know, I'm curious what you think about that. And I also feel like I want to say, like, sometimes like there isn't a hurry. Yeah,
I think obviously depending on the circumstances, it would, again, the evidence would suggest, and in Tutu's work, that it's a bit like a cycle, almost like the grief cycle that you have to go through, or a process. Mm-hmm. So it can't be done at speed. So that process would involve that exploring about looking at the emotions, acknowledging or the story, the relationship, and then what are the different options? And it may be, months, years in the making, and it can't really be rushed. Just like grief, it's unique and individual to every single person. And the other thing is that for some people it can be done in other ways. There's a lovely activity in Tutu's book is that we may not want to give the apology or speak to the person face to face or even online. And for example, we can write a letter. So that can be a really creative but also powerful way to record those thoughts and feelings and use that as a way to express. You may not even give that letter to the person that you want to, but it helps you to work through it, and it can be really helpful too.
Nice.
Tell us about some of the tools that you offer.
So I think what I've been developing over the last 6 or 7 years is different resources or tools to support people with often very difficult conversations. And a lot of that starts with that self-awareness and self-reflection. So we take people at the very beginning to think about what are their values, and therefore help them to understand the triggers. So we discussed earlier where we may respond in a way that we then stop and think, gosh, what happened there? My amygdala has been hijacked. I'm suddenly not in control of my thinking part of my brain. So the triggers could be often based on our values, but often from our own experiences and emotions. So we would look at values and triggers, and then how conflict happens and things like bias. And then think, right, when we find ourselves on the receiving end of someone raising a concern, criticising you personally or criticising the service that you're providing, how do you respond? What is a helpful way to respond? Because the immediate response might be, how dare they criticise this? Or they don't know what I've done. I have been working so hard, or you're only one of many. So helping them to understand that, and then being able to come in with these, if you like, communication tools, of which apology would be one. So there's a couple of resources. People like easy to remember little kind of scenarios. So one would be, I call it the 5 A's simply, and it's taken from research and evidence from a whole number of places, starting with that acceptance, as I mentioned. And that, I don't mean that you're accepting the blame or accepting there's been a significant mistake, but accepting that is your experience, however that may look like. And your experience will be different from my experience, but we can still speak together to try and resolve that and hopefully come up with some action. So the first one would be the acceptance. Then you'd come in with the apology. So that would be your second A. Then we're looking at actions, because people would want to know, right, well, how can I help? What would be helpful here? We can't change the past, but what could we do to resolve this for you? You can apply in a whole array of customer service as well as public sector. The 2 remaining A's, I would say, are a framework for all of this, and that's being authentic. So it's not about having a script of what you say. It would be saying, here are some useful phrases, but you make them your own. So you have to bring your true authentic self to the conversation. And then the final A is all of this done with an appreciative eye. So really trying to see again, what's the cause of this? What's underlying? Or even starting and finishing with, thank you, Kate, for bringing this to my attention. Thank you for sharing this feedback. Because it's through feedback, whether it's a complaint or a compliment, that we can improve our services, or that we can improve or prevent mistakes, that we can learn and improve from this feedback.
There's a lot there. So the first A, acceptance, is so let's say someone's bringing a criticism to Kate, and the acceptance is just the sort of accepting or acknowledging the sort of bare reality of like, well, here we are. This is really happening. Because I do think there's a moment there sometimes if someone makes a complaint that you're just like, maybe if you could sort of quickly make a defensive comment or quickly change their mind, like, oh no, that's not what I meant, or something, that it'll all go away. But so the acceptance maybe is saying, don't try to hurry this away. Here we are, we need to resolve this together. Am I getting that?
Yeah. And I think, that can be from for example, some fairly minor feedback to you, Kate. So this is how I found you, or I found this difficult. And you can accept that is what my experience has been. You don't need to accept that it's generally has to be a negative thing about you, but you can accept that is the way I've seen you from my perspective of the world. Right. And that can range from something like that to nobody told me my mother was dying scenario.
I imagine that also takes some curiosity and also really being able to almost like slow down time enough to catch your defensive reactivity in its tracks. Yeah, sure. And one of the other, I guess, it is a tool, would be that ability to be able to ask curious questions. Because we also know that if we ask a curious question, it can help take people out of their amygdala hijack into the thinking part of their brain. And that will give you that time. So if somebody's ranting and shouting and saying, you're hopeless, you've not done this, you've not done that, you may have to allow them to have that rant. And then as they start to come through the other side of that, you could come in with a question like, and so what, for example, what would be helpful for us to do now? Because in order for them to answer that, they have to actually think about how they're going to respond. Right. So certainly acceptance there from a whole range of ways, from accepting the experience to accepting that is what they believe to be true, rather than us defending it to the hilt. Because that's what you often get. People, but this is what I know, this is the reason. And it's like, it's not really always relevant, because what people need to be accepted that was what their experience was.
Which is quite challenging to receive the complaint. And as you're saying, the fight, flight, freeze, the reptilian part of the brain is like 10 times faster. Literally, the fibers are quicker, literally. So the first thing we're going to notice is like attack on us.
Yeah.
But wait. So that looms large in the beginning. So it takes some self-management or self-soothing to like, let me say, because now there are two upset people.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think for some people, it's even that acknowledgement, and it's okay to feel that. Because, often we're told, don't take it personally. But of course we take it personally.
Right.
Particularly if it's something we care about, we are going to take it personally. So you can reverse that and say, well, that may, again, back to some of the awareness of that emotion. It might be, goodness, I can suddenly feel that adrenaline surge as, so if you're saying something to me, Kate, and I'm criticizing that, or I take it as a criticism, I've suddenly got this adrenaline surge and I could feel, the hackles that I want to come back in straight away and defend.
Yeah.
But what I can do is go, right. What's going on here? You're not liking what you're hearing. So just let's pause or breathe and also move on to finding some strategies to help people in that moment.
I'm thinking about the Gottman couples therapy method. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's something I've had some training in. And they talk about defensiveness as part of a pattern, and all of these different problematic patterns in relationships, and they have an antidote for different ones. And the antidote for defensiveness is taking responsibility for some small part, whatever you can see and acknowledge as some contribution that you've made, but you can't always do that in the moment sometimes, and you don't have the freedom maybe in a more professional encounter to say like, hey, can we talk about this later? But in personal relationships, you might be able to say like, I need a few minutes to calm down before we can continue this conversation, but then, instead of defending your position, just like, what is some small thing that I can recognize I did that did contribute to this, and being willing to take ownership of that.
Yeah, exactly. And it could be something very simple. If you were, if I'm receiving that criticism and I'm noticing how I'm perceiving it in a naturally finding it a really stressful thing to hear, then even by saying, oh, right, oh gosh, I wasn't expecting that, or, well, I'm struggling with that. So again, maybe showing your own vulnerability, but even, can I get you a drink of water, or would you like to come in and have a seat? Or, so using these little tactics to literally buy people a few seconds to get themselves in that state that recognizes this is going to be a really tough conversation, particularly with anger or tears. And I'm thinking as healthcare providers, you will have relatives who may be angry, tears, and upset all within a few minutes, and they're expecting some sort of response, and yet that can be one of the most difficult things because you've not prepared for it. You don't know it's coming. But you do have that opportunity that you can get it right by showing that empathy. So, I'm really sorry. I can see you're upset, or I can hear you're angry, and one of the other strategies is to come straight in and acknowledge that. So something like, again, I'm not saying there's scripts for this, but something like, I understand, or I be careful, understand can be patronizing, but I would be so upset if I was in your shoes, or so many people are going through difficult issues at the moment around this. And it must be really hard not being able to come into hospital to visit your mother and father, or not speak to them, or whatever it is. So you're kind of using these strategies to really try and see it. You're building, in a sense, you're building rapport and empathy almost, immediately. And that's really hard for people to do if they haven't given it any thought. I mean, I often say to people, you wouldn't go to an interview without preparing some responses. And yet people go into conversations or work in relationships, a bit like we've mentioned with couples therapy. You would go into a meeting, a complaints meeting, people would go in without any preparation. And yet you wouldn't go for an interview without preparing for that. The resources that we use are very similar. Yeah. It's more difficult because you don't know how it's going to go. There's not any real structure apart from two different parties meeting up, discussing a situation.
Like you said, there aren't scripts necessarily, but it's also an area where most of us are so clueless that offering some ideas and giving some structure through these tools and offering some ways you might say something, because again, I think, this is not really discussed frequently in people's lives. Like you don't get a forgiveness 101 class when you're, in primary school or something. So we're all just kind of winging it.
One of the things that we do and that people really enjoy is we analyze some real videos of apologies. A few of them come from your side of the pond.
Oh, yeah. It was a long tradition of public apology in the U.S.
And it's often politicians. Some are the best examples. And people really, they can see that. They can watch a video of someone else and very quickly, I give them the elements first and say, right, this is what you're looking for. And they very quickly pick up, yes, they did this, this and this, but not that. What's more challenging, interestingly, is finding some really good apologies. But I think that can really help the learning. And then again, they can tease out, what were the statements that were helpful? What about the body language? What are the words? There's one where it is a politician who says, I'm sorry if I offended you. That's just the worst apology, because one is if,
right,
and it kind of negates that any kind of authenticity that you are apologizing. So it should always be, I'm really sorry for that, or for your experience, or, so it's current. So not ever if or may. And then if I offended you, because what you're doing when you're saying that is, it's basically your fault, Kate, for being offended.
Right.
You're not apologizing for what you have done.
Right.
So if you flip that over, the apology should be, I'm really sorry for speaking to you in the manner when I said X, Y, and Z, or whatever. So you should be specific about what the issue, mistake, error, offence was, and then look at what would be your actions and your learning from that in order to make it meaningful.
So adding on, I'm sorry for saying XYZ. I wouldn't have said it had I known how hurtful it would have been. In the future, I'll whatever, something like that, or like, I've really learned a lot from this or something. Yeah,
exactly. So you're incorporating all of that, all of those elements together. And the other one is a good apology. You do actually have to say sorry or I apologize, whereas you get a lot of people who use regret. I'll say regret doesn't cut it either. It's not. I think I am sorry is much more powerful than even we regret. It's like if someone's died, you don't say I regret your loss.
Yeah.
Or I'm sorry, can I offer condolences? So the language is something that I'm really interested in. I think we can really focus on using positive, powerful language in these conversations as well.
I'm part of a community where there was a leader who had needed to issue an apology, let us say. And some members of the community accepted the apology, other members have not, which is hard at in the sort of social level when there's mixed responses to an apology. And some of the complaints about the apology were that it was too legalistic sounding, or, it seemed to be holding something back in some way, or it seemed like written by lawyers or something. So what are some of the ways that we can make that kind of heartfelt, sincere apology that doesn't end up sounding legalistic? I don't know if that's a good question or not, but.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's one that certainly I'm asked a lot, particularly with doctors, because there is still a fear of being sued, of litigation, if you say sorry. In the United Kingdom, we are fortunate, though, that we have a legal framework that is very clear that giving an apology is not an admission of liability. So if you make a significant medical error, for example, you could go on to be sued, but the apology is not a key part of that. It's completely separate. Apologies acts. But we also know from evidence from the US, actually, from a number of years ago, there was a well-known study that looked at doctors that had apologised for medical errors. And it was in fact the opposite, that these patients or relatives were much less likely to go on and take any kind of legal action if they were open and honest and provided a meaningful apology. So it's very clear, but I think there are still a number of myths out there that it's like being in a car crash where you should never say you did anything wrong.
Right.
And that is not the case. And we also have a legal framework around the duty of candour in the United Kingdom, which means if there is a mistake made, even if the person or the patient hasn't complained, you have a duty to be open and honest about the mistake that has been made, and that includes an apology.
Fascinating.
So I think if there's one message that I really attempt to get out there when I'm speaking to healthcare professionals is an apology is not an admission of liability, and it's okay to say sorry. And in fact, when you do and you can resolve the complaint, you're less likely to to have any further communication or legal action from the patient or relative.
Because people feeling not cared about are more likely to escalate.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, even in the process, you can do really well around that resolution. You can say you're going to take actions. You can meet with people and have a positive conversation. But if you don't even follow through some of those actions, then people may well still take things further because they feel the frustration. They feel undervalued. Again, going right back to the very beginning about not being listened to.
Right. Or if the apology doesn't feel like it changes anyone's actions. Right. I can think about this in families too, right? Someone says, I'm sorry, but then they never do anything different. So then the apology sort of loses credibility in some way because there's something inherent in apologizing that the person is saying, I would do something different, or I plan to do something different, or I've learned from this or something.
Yes. And I think that's where the kind of final element in the steps is those actions. So what has been learning? And it may be simply I have reflected on it and I got it wrong, and I'm really sorry what I said. I have reflected. We have looked at complete change in process, or we've changed procedures as a result of this error.
The only other A I want to make sure to dive in and say something about here is I really like the A for appreciation. Because, again, I think it sort of reminds us to treat this as an opportunity, which is kind of a reframe on dealing with a complaint. And it feels like a nice reminder that, and again, I'm thinking more on the personal level, that when someone brings a complaint to us, as easy as it is to get defensive, it's also an opportunity to find better understanding. And it also is brave and involves some amount of trust, right? If someone's bringing a complaint to you, they trust you on some level to maybe be able to navigate it, right? Or to take in the feedback. Like, I don't know, in my experience, if I had a complaint about somebody and I just thought there's no way this person's going to be able to hear this or receive this or do anything about this, or I wouldn't say anything. And then the silence would just fester. So appreciating that they've given you the opportunity to take that in, and that it's an expression of some kind of trust in you that maybe you can do something or respond appropriately. I don't know.
Yeah, I think a previous ombudsman used to talk about complaints or feedback being a gift. And that gift, as you said, is that opportunity to listen and learn and change. And use it as that opportunity for learning. And if we can absolutely do that. And I think in organisations that I work with around healthcare, often too, that complaint may go to someone in a more junior facing role. So, for example, a healthcare worker, care assistant, a student nurse, or a junior doctor, for example. And I would really be encouraging them to feel empowered to respond, not to dismiss it or have to get somebody more senior. So part of it would be apology can be everyone's business if they certainly if they have the confidence in the skill. Because that person, as you said, must have a degree of trust to bring their complaint to them. Rather than kind of say, oh, well, I'm going to speak to such and such, or you have to put your complaint in writing. It would be through some of this work that they would be able to say, well, gosh, Kate, thank you for trusting that to tell me about what happened or to give me your complaint, because it's really important that we do get this feedback. So I'm going to check out with you how you would like me to take this forward. So they've got that ownership and that ability to, perhaps for many people, resolve it there and then by offering the apology or saying, right, how can we work through this? And for them, it gives them actually peace of mind. It gives them the knowledge that they've done something worthwhile by hearing that and having that appreciative response to the complaint.
That completely pivots the perception too, as you two talk about that. Instead of like, oh no, they saw a weakness of mine, or they're finding faults with me. How dare they? It's like, ooh, actually, they think I can actually handle this.
Yeah. I think they can see that as a compliment that you're the one, so you're the one that they've decided to tell. You're the one that they want give the feedback to.
Mm-hmm.
We can see a complaint or a concern as a form of feedback, which it is, then here it is. Here's your opportunity to respond in a way that's helpful and within your gift to resolve.
Could you also tell us a bit about your complaints coach program? What will you be teaching? Who's it for?
The complaints coach, it draws on a number of elements that I have been studying and sharing over the last 6 or 7 years around our values and triggers, the biases that we draw on, that many of are unconscious, and how that plays into conflict, whether we're on the receiving end of. We look at empathy and emotions, because that's, for me, really crucial, which feeds into the amygdala hijack and understanding what's going on in our brains. Then we start to look at the ways we can respond. So like apology, forgiveness, and language that I've mentioned. And then as we go through, we look at more challenging type behaviours that people can encounter with complaints. So particularly anger, tears, distress, and what I call high conflict. And there is some work in the literature. And these are often people who can behave in very extreme ways with their behaviour. A very small number of people can use a huge amount of resource, particularly in the sectors that I'm involved in. So you may have a handful of people who complain regularly, and 20-page letters of a complaint, and needs a lot of resource to respond to that. And some literature that suggests we should respond differently to those types of behaviours, which is fascinating as well. Then I look at a little bit around investigation, so how we should look into a complaint, although there's not an awful lot on process. It's much more around how we respond. And then a little bit around failure and mistakes. And again, this links beautifully to mindful self-compassion, because if we can acknowledge that we will make mistakes, that we will get it wrong sometimes, then we can respond in ways that's much kinder to ourselves. And so I'm thinking there about the notion of the metaphor around the kintsugi, the Japanese bowl, the fracture, the chip, the crack in the bowl is repaired with gold, and that is a metaphor for all of us. We've all made mistakes. We've all had failures in our lives. We've all suffered, lived with adversity in some shape or form. And if we can accept and see that as a strength, then we should be more self-forgiving and self-compassionate. And then finally, the complaints coach, we look at being on the receiving end. So that's where I've got this great opportunity to bring in self-care, self-compassion.
Well, thank you so much, Dorothy. This has been a lovely conversation.
Yes. Where can people go to follow you and learn more from you?
Oh, thank you. I have a website, so people can find out information on my website, which is www.dorothyarmstrong.net. You can also follow me on Twitter and on LinkedIn.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll share all that information in our show notes. Thank you for your time. This is such an illuminating conversation. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.